Welcome everybody to the last class of this rather short history course on the American West. I hope all of you got the slides from the third session, and I'll send the slides from this session probably this afternoon. Also, I apologize for a little bit of confusion about the end of the movie The Searchers, one of the best movies ever of any genre, I think. I've seen it several times, but the last time it's probably good 15 years ago. And so I was a little confused about the ending. Thank you to several people who sent me some links so I could really get it straight. The John Wayne character did in fact bring his niece back to his family, but it did not really end happily as the John Wayne character walked out the door into the sunset, really with most of his life in tatters. Anyway, thank you. It's all part of what's called the captivity narratives. And the captivity narratives are a genre all by itself that goes all the way back to the colonial days, to the Pilgrims, in fact. Usually written as an autobiography of someone a white person who was kidnapped by Indians and managed to escape or somehow got free and then wrote about it. Well, The Searchers isn't quite that way, but it is part of this overall genre of captivity narratives. All right. Although the original outline of the course was that I would take in the whole of the 20th century and maybe even add a few comments about the 21st, as I was reviewing my notes and slides, it's impossible to cover the whole century in an hour and a half. So I decided I'm going to concentrate only on the first half of the 20th century. Anyway, you guys know what happened in the second half. Most of you lived through at least a good part of it, and I lived through the entire second half. Today we'll talk about the economy, particularly agriculture, oil, and water, also Indians, the effect of the Depression, and war. And maybe we'll look at some of the cities that have grown up during the first half of the century. As an overriding theme, it is the importance of the federal government in the development of the West. Through the first part of this session, I'm going to take off my history hat and put on my economist hat. You poor people. But I promise no mathematics. All right? That's a promise. And it's hard to talk about economics without mathematics. All right, first, let's do a little overview of the 1890s, setting the scene for the first half of the 20th century. We always start with our map. Geography is crucial to any look at history. In the 1890s, there were basically only two industries. Meg, is my little cursor showing up?
Yes, it is. It's just light.
Okay.
Actually, it's not showing up as your laser pointer. If you want to go up to the top and re-enable your laser pointer, that would be great.
Okay, so what do
Annotations.
All right, annotations and then spotlight, right? Okay, does that do something? Good.
Yes.
Okay, agriculture. There was really only agriculture in the Great Plains and in Oregon, in the very fertile Willamette Valley, and of course, the great Central Valley of California. That's about it. There was also mining as a major industry. It was concentrated.
Nice.
I'm sorry.
I muted people. It's okay.
Okay. The mining was mostly concentrated in the Rockies, although there was still some gold in the foothills of the Sierras, the western foothills. There was really only one real city. You can guess what that is: San Francisco. Well, we said that agriculture was hard, particularly on the plains. Remember the sod houses? These people lived a very hard life. They generally were homesteaders that came flooding into the plains in the 1870s, 80s. And at that time, the plains were reasonably well watered and agriculture worked and the homesteaders succeeded. By the 1890s, a 15-year cycle of weather hit and it was drought. It was very, very hard. And these people, many of them left. Actually, the Great Plains lost population in the 1890s. There's another sod house. This one is pretty prosperous. Broken Bow in Nebraska in the 1890s had glass windows, a good roof, lots of metal pots and pans. This family worked out reasonably well, but you can see they were not living the gay 90s. Well, if that's agriculture, what about mining? This is the, let me get rid of this. This is the Speculator copper mine in Butte, Montana. It's copper. And it was the deepest mine in the West and the richest. It actually made Butte, Montana, the richest town in the whole country. About 1899, a mining magnate, a fellow who owned this mine, his name was Marcus Daly. He teamed up with Rockefeller Standard Oil, which supplied the money, to establish what was called the Amalgamated Copper Mining Company. Anybody know what we call it today? That's right, Anaconda. Unfortunately, this mine had a devastating fire in 1917, killed 168 miners, and really cut down Butte, Montana to a much more normal town. To make things worse, in 1893, there was a severe depression, kind of like the depression of the 1830s. The 1893 depression was caused by financial manipulations in the East, resulting in bank failures. And although the depression was nationwide, the West was much harder hit. The gay 90s were definitely an Eastern phenomenon. Except, of course, California. California is always an exception, kind of like Texas. In California, there were big railroads that were headquartered there, the Great Southern Pacific. And there were some people in San Francisco who had joined the gay 90s. This picture on the left is a picture of the early Nob Hill. This is where the nabobs hung out. The big four of California each had a big mansion on Nob Hill. The one on the top, I don't know if you can tell, this was the mansion of Mark Hopkins. Hopkins here all the time. In fact, this was knocked down later and a hotel built, the Mark Hopkins Hotel. If you ever go to San Francisco, go up to the Mark, and there's a bar on the top floor called the Top of the Mark. The view from that bar is spectacular, and they make a really good martini. A really expensive martini, but it is good. And they claim that the martini was actually invented or developed by a bartender at the Top of the Mark in the 1930s. Well, I'm not so sure, but still, it's a fun place to visit. Agriculture was very big in California. By 1890, California was producing 40 million bushels of wheat. That was the second largest crop in the country. And unlike the family farms on the prairies or in the east, it was predominantly large industrial farms. This is where the industrial farms really got started. It was helped a great deal by the railroads. There was the refrigerator car that was developed in the East in roughly the 1880s, and that allowed large-scale agriculture in California to be transported to the East and the very big market that existed there. So the railroads and the agriculture were completely intertwined. We're now going to talk some economics. There is a model called the colonial economy, developed by economists, including myself, in roughly the 1960s and 70s. And it had to do with modeling the particular economies that grew up in colonies, mostly the Africa and Latin America. My own experience was mostly in Africa. What are some of the attributes of this colonial economy? First, most of the production in the colonial economy was for export. Export back to the colonizer, which is generally in this model called the metropole. Okay, for interest, Kenya and Tanzania, two countries I visited many times, the metropole, of course, was England. The products that were produced for export were almost completely raw materials, generally agriculture and mining. There might be some refining and smelting, but very little industry producing final products. They were imported from the metropole. Also, each town and region would tend to be very highly specialized, not diversified, dependent on one product. And the demand for that product was what the economists call derived demand. It was dependent on the demand for final goods that the raw materials were used for. That's actually fairly important because what that means is if the price of the final goods varied, in other words, went down from time to time, the demand for the raw materials produced in the colonial economy went down by more. Finance and control, almost all from the metropole. Very little, if any, local banking. And very few companies were headquartered in the colony. And finally, the key infrastructure was predominantly long-range transport based on the metropole's money and interest. Okay, so this model shows that the colonial economy was based on servicing the colonizer's colony. Okay, well, what's this got to do with the West? It actually describes the economy of the West with respect to the East. For instance, the development of cities was delayed. Los Angeles in the 1890s and just turn of the century was a small town and stayed small until the movie studios moved in and big oil. There were a few mining and ranching towns, generally along the rail lines. Examples were Denver, Helena, Salt Lake, Phoenix, Dallas, Austin, Albuquerque. These were towns that developed almost entirely to service the local agricultural industry and were totally dependent on the railroad. One exception was Butte, and because of that speculator mine and other mines, Salt Lake also had a mining industry around it. But of course, California was an exception. San Francisco was the exception. It developed early in the gold rush. Now, as I mentioned, derived demand implies price and output volatility. The prices of raw materials could change a lot when prices in the East changed a little. Depending on inventory policy, transportation costs, and competition, one could say when the East catches a cold, the West catches pneumonia. So you can see by the concentration in agriculture and mining and the delayed development of cities, there are a lot of attributes of the Western economy in the United States in the 1890s and early 20th century, which fit the attributes of the colonial economy. So one can use the same kind of models. Corporate farms, this big industrial agriculture in the California Central Valley, generally were owned in the East. And indeed, if ag prices went down enough, a lot of these industrial farms simply stopped producing. Family farms, these farmers on the Great Plains, actually were more stable, even though they were having a very hard time. So the saying is that a corporate farm is a way of making money. A family farm is a way of life. And everything was dependent on the railroads. And the railroads were frequently local monopolies. Well, the West did not stay dependent on agriculture and mining for the whole of the 20th century, not by a long shot. Oil, the black gold. The first Western oil was found in Southern California in the late 19th century. Small amounts were pumped around the Los Angeles area. There was a field called Corsicana. It was discovered in the 1890s, 1896 actually. But in 1900, all of the West produced about 9% of the country's oil. Most of the oil, interestingly enough, was from Pennsylvania, particularly Western Pennsylvania. That was the first industry that started an industrial boom in Pittsburgh. Then, January 10th, 1901, on a hill in southern Texas, Spindletop. This was the beginning of big oil in Texas. A fellow named Anthony Lucas was drilling for oil on top of a salt dome near Beaumont in Texas. He thought, well, it's a reasonable speculation. He could make money if it produced as much as 5 barrels per day. 5. At around 1,000 feet, Lucas hit the gusher. When they contained it, it pumped 100,000 barrels per day, more than all the other oil wells in the country combined. Just this one pump. The population of Beaumont went from 10,000 to 50,000, and more than 100 oil companies formed, all trying to pump from the top of that salt dome. It changed everything. Anyone ever heard of the Texas company? What's it called today? It still exists. It's Texaco. Well, Texas was not the only place where oil was discovered. Now, I've said that California had produced a small amount of oil in roughly the 1890s, and they had discovered some more. They were drilling. And by 1910, the Los Angeles oil fields produced about 77 million barrels. The population of LA pretty much doubled between that. This was before the movies came. But it was nothing compared to Texas until in the teens, in the LA area, Signal Hill, 1921. Shell Oil, an English-Dutch company, kept drilling east of Long Beach. They had the money to drill much deeper, at almost 3,000 feet, the Gusher. Not quite Signal Hill quantities, but enough at around 1,000 barrels per day to make it very profitable, and the rush was on. By 1923, over 100 wells producing some 14,000 barrels per day. Well, remember, Signal Hill was 100,000, but still 14,000 barrels per day is a lot. And indeed, you can still see pumping wells in the middle of Los Angeles. For example, along the San Diego Freeway, east of Long Beach, you see the wells pumping right in front of big conurbation houses, big housing tracts that are common in the LA area. Indeed, Beverly Hills High School had a producing well on the high school grounds in the back. And it actually continued pumping until 2016. And it financed a good part of the LA school system budget. Now, how does this fit into the colonial economy? The early companies were mostly controlled in the East, not where the oil was. Texaco, where it started, was bought out by Buckskin Joe, who was from Pennsylvania. And he had backing from New York financial interests. Gulf Oil, a big oil company still producing today, was bought out by William Mellon and took over Spindletop. Money and control came from Pittsburgh. In California, Standard Oil of California was one of the Rockefeller companies created after the trust was broken, controlled the oil coming from east of Long Beach. Money and control still in the East. Shell was the biggest, second biggest in California. This was a Dutch English country. It was the colonial economy that was working in the West in the very early 20th century. But there was some that stayed, that was actually headquartered in the West. The West was starting to grow. Union Oil, for instance, was founded and stayed in Southern California. Phillips, Sinclair, and Getty were all from Oklahoma that had become a big oil state in the 1920s. Humble Oil was formed and stayed in Texas, guess what? That's the current Exxon. Also, Southern Texas and Southern California developed refining centers. So they didn't just ship the crude oil out, as you might expect from the colonial economy model. Still, it was for export, but they were exporting more refined products, not the raw materials. And it was serious industrial development, and subsidiary industries developed, such as tool making, pipe making, steel cable, lumber. So the West was starting to grow out of the extremes of the colonial economy by the 1920s. Still, there was a big problem with oil. Can you guess? Anyone see a problem? Oil was almost totally free from regulation at the beginning. And as you can see there, there's a problem of an awful lot of straws dipping into the same pool of oil. Indeed, the rule that developed was called the rule of capture. Now, the rule of capture was that anybody who could get the oil out of the ground owned it. Okay? This was true even if they got the oil from an oil pool that was under somebody else's property. That's what caused this extreme concentration of wells under fairly large pools of oil, but it was extremely inefficient. Production soared, but there was a big need for control. Well, should the feds step in? As you can guess, not in Texas. In Texas, the Texas Railroad Commission was established in the 1890s. Texas Railroad Commission became an extraordinarily important agency for the whole country. It was established to regulate railroad rates and competition. Remember how important the railroads were in the early Western economy. Something had to be done. In the federal government, the ICC was established, the Internal Commerce Commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, sorry. And the Texans, who didn't particularly want to have anything to do with federal regulation, established their own. Okay. In 1917, Texas passed the Pipeline Petroleum Law. And what that did was really quite important. Oil companies became common carriers, legally equivalent to the railroads. That allowed the Texas Railroad Commission to regulate production, spacing of wells, pumping, and pricing for the oil companies. Still, however, the rule of capture predominated. Texas Railroad Commission could regulate some things, but not the idea that if you could pump the oil, you owned it. That was still the basic rule. In 1924, the Federal Oil Conservation Board was created, a federal agency to regulate oil. But a federal suit by the oil companies stripped it of power. In the late 1920s, the Texas Railroad Commission, the TRC, ordered rationing of production in Texas. And the Petroleum Institute for the whole country agreed to voluntary rationing set by the TRC. So the TRC was running the whole country's oil regulation. It didn't work out well enough. Guess what happened in 1929? The Great Crash. By 31, there was a total crisis as oil from East Texas flooded the depression market and prices plunged. Well, what was this about East Texas? In 1930, there was another oil discovery on the Bradford Farms. It was the biggest one yet, bigger than Signal Hill. And by 1933, it was producing 60% of the oil in the state and 22% of the oil pumped in the entire world. It was pumping some 600,000 barrels of crude oil per day. And that was on top of the oil that was already flooding the market in the Great Depression. Prices went to the floor. Well, you can see that the Texan and Oklahoma governments were really hard pressed. This cartoon from August 1931, hold that line. It was the governors of the state trying to hold the floodgates of all that oil. Did they hold the line? Well, pretty much. Production rationing survived, and the TRC regulatory powers were extended to most states, not legally, but de facto. In 1935, the Connolly Hot Oil Act of federal legislation to regulate interstate commerce in oil agreed to enforce the production directives of the TRC. The TRC ruled the oil industry in the country. Talk about the tail wagging the dog. Texas was wagging the country in terms of oil. And indeed, the TRC became the model for OPEC. We've all heard of OPEC. That was in the 1970s. Its power declined as the proportion of oil pumped from Texas declined. And in 1978, gosh, we're talking about the 1970s here, finally, the federal government, their Natural Gas Policy Act took over regulation, even in Texas. But TRC is still there. That's a picture of its current headquarters. Well, that's about oil. We're going to switch gears and talk about the other liquid that was so important, water. But because we're switching gears, might be a time for some questions, if there are any. Meg?
There are currently no questions in the chat, but if anybody wants to raise their hand, or we can just go on.
Okay, we can certainly just go on.
Okay.
Back to the map. The West is arid, but each winter there's a lot of water. Where is this water? It's stored in the mountains as snow. And this year, the snowpack is really huge, and that's very fortunate. So what happens with this water? The snow does melt, and it becomes the drainage of the West. It becomes what is drained in the West. There are 5 primary drainage basins, which create the great waters of the West. The Northern and Western Rockies and the Cascades up here drain into the Great Columbia River and the Snakes. That's the Snake River, if you can see my cursor, and then the Columbia flowing out to the Pacific. One of the great drains of the West.
Your laser pointer has shut off again.
You want me to try again?
That's up to you.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to work. You guys are familiar enough with the map, I can just say what the areas are. The Central Rockies drain into the Green and Colorado rivers. And of course, the Colorado River, one of the great rivers of the West. The Western Sierras, another big drainage area, drain into the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers in California's Central Valley. And of course, we can't forget the Central Rockies and the Eastern Sierras draining into, do you remember? Into the sinks in the Great Basin of Nevada. So we have all this water draining into really significant rivers. And of course, on the eastern side, in the Front Range, the water drains into the big rivers crossing the plains that we talked about before. What to do? Can something be done to contain all of this? Well, there was a fellow who thought big and thought that it could, John Wesley Powell. He figured out how this water could be controlled and used. He made a very famous trip down the Colorado through the Grand Canyon, one of the first to do that. Now everybody can do it. It's a whole industry going down the Colorado through the Grand Canyon. But John Wesley Powell's great contribution was not exploring the Colorado. In 1979, Powell convinced the Congress to take the topological corps out of the Army Corps of Engineers, and transform it into a new private agency, the U.S. Geological Survey. Its headquarters are right here in Reston, where I live. And its primary job was landscape and hydrological mapping. In part, that was what it did, but it became really a dam finding agency. The USGS was folded into the Interior Department. Remember, he wanted it out of the Army. And the Interior Department was generally the department where agencies were stored if they didn't know what to do with it. In fact, it had a nickname, the Bureau of Everything Else. Just the landscape, but the hydrology of the West. And that allowed them to find out where dams could be built. But this opened up a war within the federal government. Agencies started developing all over the place, mainly to control the two big resources that the federal government owned. That is the land and the water. Here are a few of them. The Bureau of Reclamation, the dam planners and builders. That was really the idea of Teddy Roosevelt. And he was very big on an agency to build dams wherever the USGS found they could be done. There was also the Government Land Office, now the Bureau of Land Management. That was administered federally, but it administered all the federally owned lands not claimed by another agency. In other words, the Bureau of Reclamation around the dams, or the Indian Bureau, the BIA, that owned the reservation trusts, the USGS, which had its own claim on some of the lands, and very much the National Park Service, which grew up really from the 1920s on, even though there were national parks dating back into the 19th century. Well, the Army wasn't willing to give up entirely. Its Corps of Engineers established a civilian section, mainly to build canals, but also in doing, and ports. Canals and ports were their main objective at first, but they became dam builders competing with the Bureau of Reclamation. And finally, the Agriculture Department got in the act, the Forest Service, which some people probably think is part of the Interior Department. It's not. It's all about agriculture, the agriculture being lumber, and the Soil Conservation Service, now known as the National Resources Conservation. So you can see what happened is in the 1920s and beyond, the federal government realized that by controlling the land and the water, they had control of the West. And so various agencies competed to do that. One of the first and biggest Bureau of Reclamation projects was Hoover Dam. It was conceived of by Hoover when he was president, and it was finally completed, not really until 1944, but it was definitely the biggest. Unfortunately, we are now in the middle of a 20-year drought, and you can really see the effects on Hoover Dam. The first top picture is Hoover Dam in about the year 2000. The reservoir behind it, called Lake Mead, over 100 miles long, the biggest reservoir in the country, was full. You can see the water's right up to the top of the dam. 2023, this year, Lake Mead, after 22 years of drought, now look at Hoover Dam. It's almost entirely exposed. The water levels have dropped 70 feet. The drought in the West is real. And the effects have been very significant. Well, the Hoover Dam was not the only big dam. Grand Coulee was a big cork in the mighty Columbia River. Interestingly, this is not a Bureau of Reclamation project. This was built by the Army Corps of Engineers. The competition was very, very lively. This is the second biggest dam in the country. And what the Columbia Basin Project was, generally done, built in the 30s and the 40s, was to provide a series of corks in the Columbia and the Snake and turn the Columbia River into roughly a huge lake. Right down at the bottom near Portland is the Bonneville Dam, also a huge dam on the Columbia. And what this was for was to irrigate a large desert-like area called the Columbia Basin in the middle of the state of Washington. And it succeeded pretty well. I even worked on a project in the Columbia Basin very early in the 60s when I was at Washington State University, applying a new tool, linear programming, to distributing water from Grand Coulee. Now, the big projects were not just huge dams, but there was this California Central Valley project, also in the 30s. And what this did was a series of dams capturing water coming off the Western Sierras into the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. The Sacramento River was mostly in the north and flowed from north to south. San Joaquin River, the southern part of the Great Central Valley, flowing from south to north. And the idea here was to irrigate the entire Central Valley. It worked. The Central Valley of California produces almost every crop and actually is the largest agricultural area in the country, possibly even the most productive in the world. The bottom of that valley was an ancient seabed, and it was very, very fertile, but it didn't look fertile in the 19th century because there wasn't any water. The California Central Project provided the water and made the agriculture of the Central Valley possible. Now, there was one water project that was different. Now, I'd like to talk about it a little bit because it's interesting. It was not a federal project. It had nothing to do with the Bureau of Reclamation or the Army Corps of Engineers, but it was crucial. Let's take a look at the map of Southern California. You can see, my pointer isn't working, but you can see there's a riff that runs down.
They can see your pointer, but it's light, so please do use it.
Okay, right here. This is a riff, like the riff in East Africa, where two continental plates come together. And it forms a big valley that is between the Western Sierras and over here called the White Mountains. There's a river that flows, of course, because it drains the snowpack from these mountains, and it's called the Owens River. And this is indeed called the Owens Valley. But look, it looks almost like an arrow that's pointing south. If you can make it bend, guess where it ends up? Los Angeles. Well, there was a fellow named William Mulholland. Here's another more detailed map of the Owens Valley. White Mountains on the east, Sierras, including Mount Whitney, the highest point in the continental US, on the west. Now, William Mulholland thought big. He said, you've got all this water in this Owens Valley. That's kind of useless. It only produces water for agriculture. And indeed, the Owens Valley was very fertile and produced a lot on family farms where people who did not find gold in California settled there successfully. Well, Mulholland was the director of the Los Angeles Water Authority. And he said, gosh, all you have to do is take this water from the Owens Valley and ship it to Los Angeles. Now, how to do that? It was the Owens River Water Project. Aqueducts and dams for 240 miles over the San Bernardino Mountains. I don't know if any of you have been in the San Bernardino Mountains. There's big recreation areas, Big Bear is up there. They're quite reasonable mountains. They're not the Sierras, they're part of the Coast Range, but they're quite reasonable mountains. Well, how do you get the water over it? Well, notice that Owens Valley is considerably higher in elevation than Los Angeles. So if you can start the water downhill, controlled, and pump it through a bunch of, or let it go through a bunch of electricity generating stations, you can generate enough power to pump the water up the hill over the mountains. And this picture of the current Los Angeles aqueduct gives an idea. They would let the water come down, it would go through a power station, and then that would pump it up the next mountain. And pretty much at the top, there were two large dams. This is a picture of the St. Francis Dam after it was finished, but before a great catastrophe. In 1928, the St. Francis Dam collapsed. It killed many, and this huge reservoir behind it just cascaded down into the area of what they now call the Inland Empire, west of Los Angeles, killed many, many people. And Mulholland was considered the architect of all this. He was to a certain extent, although he didn't design the dam, but it was designed badly. It was constructed quickly, much too quickly, and that's why it collapsed. Anybody see the movie Chinatown? Really great movie, but that's what it was about, the collapse of the St. Francis Dam. And Mulholland, who, by the way, owned a lot of land in the San Fernando Valley where the aqueduct went right through and could irrigate his land. But he became really an anathema in Los Angeles, which did not prevent them from naming a very pretty drive, Mulholland Drive in the Hollywood Hills. It's a really pretty drive named after him. Well, what was happening in the Owens Valley? The Owens Valley, which was a beautiful green area, turned into a desert. What Mulholland did at the beginning was to buy out farmers relatively cheaply, although for the farmers it seemed like a lot of money. And that they were happy to sell out until they realized what Mulholland was doing, taking their water for their irrigation and shipping it to Los Angeles. They sued and lost. Teddy Roosevelt himself declared that Los Angeles should have the water. They actually tried to destroy the aqueduct, and there were various fights, but ultimately the farmers of the Owens Valley lost out, and the Owens Valley became a kind of desert. But Los Angeles had a lot of water, and with the movie industry growing like mad, oil still doing well, and subsidiary industries growing, the Owens Valley allowed the development of Los Angeles. And a little bit later, the Hoover Dam, which also supplied water to Los Angeles, as well as Las Vegas and Phoenix. okay, enough about water. 1929, the great drop in the stock market, the big crash. By 1930, 31, the Depression had hit. When prices declined in the East, which they did severely, the bottom fell out of the West. Oil hit a low of 2 cents per barrel. 2 cents. It was not enough to make any money pumping oil in 1932. In Colorado, per capita income dropped 40% in these 4 years, from 29 to 33. That's almost half. In the Pacific Northwest, lumber was a big industry, dropped by 2/3. In Idaho, silver production was a big industry, went from 39 million to 9 million. And on the Great Plains, in addition to the disastrously low prices, the weather cycle changed again and created the black blizzards. Now, I've traveled through the Great Plains a lot. I've been there in the winter and the summer. And the weather's pretty unpleasant, but I cannot imagine anything like these dust storms. Combined with the low prices, it made living on the Great Plains untenable. Oops, come on. This is a very famous photograph of a family, at least the father and 2 kids, rushing to get inside of a dust storm that was coming. I've read of various accounts of the dust storms on the plains, and they are horrific. All of this area in the sky, that's not sky, that's all dust. And I don't know if this guy obviously made it, because the photograph was taken and became almost iconic. It was devastating. And as a result, people had to move. They generally thought they could get to California. The Okies, these are people leaving Oklahoma, but there were also Dokies from the Dakotas. And I think there was a word, I can't remember it, from Kansas and Nebraska. Many people left the plains and for the most part decided to travel west to California. However, California was suffering the Depression too. Didn't have the dust storms, but these Californians were suffering low prices, high unemployment, and they did not welcome the Okies, Dokies, and the people from the Great Plains fleeing the dust storms and the disastrous prices. Well, what happened in 1932? We got a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And one of the New Deal ideas was to set up camps in California, mainly to house the people fleeing from the plains. And there were quite a few of these camps. And it's sort of interesting because these camps created their own little societies. They had radio stations, police, and since people didn't have so much to do, this is where country music was not founded, of course, but really grew to be a great genre of its own, and really took the country from storm. Merle Haggard, for instance, was born in Oildale, California during the Depression. Now, Oildale was not one of the camps, but it was a small town, and Haggard grew up listening to the country music that was being sung in these camps, including a fellow named Woody Guthrie. You've all heard of Woody Guthrie. He performed all over California during the Depression, including in the camps. Well, the WPA, the Work Projects Administration, hired photographers to document the Depression. And one of the best was a photographer named Dorothea Lange. This picture, which she took of the destitute mother, became iconic and became almost a symbol of the hard life of people, of rural people in the Depression. It's interesting, I read about these photographs and what Dorothea Lange wrote about in her autobiography. This looks like it was almost candid. No, Dorothea Lange spent an entire morning with this family who was selling fruit along the highway. And these were all staged photos, but they're great photos. And as I said, became almost a symbol of rural areas in the Depression. FDR was elected, FDR established the New Deal. And with the New Deal came what a lot of historians call the alphabet soup agencies. Here are a few of them, all of which were very important in the West. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, it actually paid farmers not to grow crops. A rather strange policy because people were hungry, but prices were so low that the idea was to reduce the supply and increase the incentive for more agriculture. So you pay farmers not to grow in order to provide an incentive to grow. I don't think they thought that one out very well. A much more successful agency, the CCC, Civilian Conservation Service. This was really a great agency. It took unemployed people, mostly from the cities, to put them to work building bridges, parks, roads, and the number of CCC projects is very large. Our own Shenandoah National Park and the Blue Ridge Parkway was built by the CCC. The NRA, the National Recovery Administration, well, this one was to allow businesses to collude to raise prices. The Supreme Court said, nope, that's unconstitutional. FDR was very annoyed at the Supreme Court for doing that and actually threatened to pack the court in order to reverse it. Fortunately, he did not do that. The REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, actually was very successful in expanding electrification in rural areas that did not have electricity and was provided by the projects of the REA. And then one of the most famous, the WPA, Work Projects Administration, Construction and Jobs. Many of the dams, in part Hoover Dam, were projects of the WPA. And finally, the Federal Relief, Emergency Relief, FERA. This was the administration that built those camps in California. And I think has turned into what we know as FEMA today. Sometimes a controversial administration, but still does provide a great deal of relief to hurricane victims, for instance, Katrina. It stemmed out of the New Deal alphabet soup agencies. Finally, the BIA, which was not a new agency, but there was a revolution in Indian policy. Indian policy. Remember the Dawes Act? The infamous Dawes Act. Reservations were dismantled. Individual Indian families were given reservation land, 160 acres each. Generally, they could not survive on this land. The worst part were children taken from families to boarding schools, including the biggest one in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Now, I've been reading about what's happened in Canada with these schools, and they've been finding graveyards of thousands of children. Even though the Dawes Act policies were really bad, I don't think there's anything equivalent to that happened in the boarding schools established as a result of the Dawes Act. Still, the Dawes Act was assimilation policy taken to the extremes. By the 1920s, it had become pretty obvious that this was not working. Most of the reservations that were supposed to be dismantled actually still existed. And the Indian governments, which were supposed to be dismantled, actually were very important in distributing what were called the annuities, mostly food and tools, to Indians that could definitely not survive on their 160 acres per family. Well, by the 20s, a fellow named John Collier, who worked at the Brookings Institution, wrote the Merriam Report. It was a devastating attack on the Dawes Act and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was supposed to implement the policies of the Dawes Act. Well, Roosevelt read the Merriam Report and did a very Roosevelt-like thing. He appointed Collier as head of the agency that he had attacked the most. Collier became the head of the BIA. Also, at this time, the Indian Reorganization Act, really a result from the Merriam Report and the administration by Collier of what became the new BIA. What did this act do? It stopped the sale of surplus land on reservations. Now, what was supposed to happen with the Dawes Act is they give off these 160-acre plots, but you would have land left over from the reservation. And the Dawes Act said, well, this land left over could be sold to the whites. And a lot of it was sold, and that's why a lot of reservations shrunk in size. And if you look at reservation maps, which I'm not going to show, the reservation land was probably half by the 1930s as it was, say, in the 1890s. The IRA, the Indian Reservation Act, encouraged the formation of tribal governments with written constitutions. It actually turned the Dawes Act on its head. They said, no, reservations are good and tribal governments should rule them. And it reestablished a degree of sovereignty for the tribes that would form governments. They weren't quite Jefferson's idea of dependent nations, but they did establish a degree of sovereignty. And then the New Deal funneled money and regulations onto the reservations. All of those agencies came onto reservations of tribes that would establish a government with a written constitution. Well, the money was welcomed, but not the reservation, regulations. All of these agencies dictated economic development policy on tribes that had lived on these reservations before the Dawes Act, more or less successfully. All of these New Deal policies and regulations applied to the tribes that accepted the reorganization, did not force it upon the tribes. And therefore, there were many tribes that said, thanks, but no thanks. These policies did not take enough account of the great differences between the tribes. This has been a problem of Indian policy all along. The whites talked about race. Indians were a race, and therefore there wasn't much difference between one Indian and another. They were all Indians. Not so. Indians identified not as a member of a race. They didn't recognize this. In fact, I think some of the Indians I've talked to think of that as being a very strange idea. And Indians identified with the tribe. Well, eventually, as this became better known, a new problem developed. Who was a member of the tribe? Now, all of a sudden, with all of this New Deal money coming into the tribe, it was very important who was a member of the tribe. And this was not easy to do with all the various intermarriages that had occurred in 30, 40 years. This policy became racist in very complicated ways, down to counting drops of blood. What proportion of a person's ancestors came from one tribe to another, or were there whites in there? And finally, the policy said, look, the federal government can't deal with this. Each tribe was to set its own standards of who was a member of the tribe. But about a third of the tribes, 77 of them, including the Navajos, which was the largest tribe, both in terms of population and the size of the reservation, said, nope, we cannot take your regulation with respect particularly to grazing horses and sheep. They were the most important animals to the Navajos. The New Deal regulations tried to cut down the amount of the herds, and the Navajos said, that is not for us. And as I said, 76 other tribes also said, thanks, but no thanks. Well, if that was the Depression, by roughly 1939, the Depression was coming out, but what happened? War in the Pacific. Probably there was no event more important than the war, World War II, to the development of the West. It changed everything really in the whole country, but what it changed in the West was so dramatic. Indeed, $60 billion spent in the West by the feds during the war years. Some historians have joked that it was almost like the country had been picked up and tilted east to west, and everything federal tumbled down into the West. And particularly, naturally, California got the most, Texas got the rest, got the second most. It wasn't just money, though. 8 million people moved west of the Mississippi between 1940 and 1945. 3.5 million to California, 660,000 newcomers to Los Angeles. But Montana, the Dakotas, Nebraska, the Great Plains, they actually lost population during the war. Where did they go? They went to the coast, well, and to the east to work, generally working in war factories. Shipbuilding, 400,000 new jobs, 100,000 just in Seattle and Portland, 200,000 new jobs in California for building airplanes, 50,000 in Seattle. Texas, industrial production rose from 1.5 billion to 6.5 billion. The West was transformed during the war. But who did all this? He's the guy, Henry J. Kaiser. You've probably heard of Kaiser Steel or Kaiser Aluminum. He had many industries. But he started out before the war. Who was this guy? He first organized his company way back 1914 in British Columbia, but he moved to Oakland in 1921. Kaiser Industries is still headquartered in Oakland. He organized and headed what was called the Six Companies, construction consortium that built Hoover Dam, and had major contracts on Grand Coulee, Bonneville, and built the San Francisco Bay Bridge. That was all before the war. During the war, he developed and built assembly line shipbuilding techniques. In the West, mainly in Richmond, California, they built 1,500 ships, employed 250,000 people. He had the largest steel plant in the West, the Fontana Mill in Long Beach. He really built the town of Henderson, Nevada, and the big magnesium plant there, and shared the wartime aluminum market with Alcoa. Aluminum, of course, took off because it was used in the airplanes. He established and built company towns in Los Angeles and Portland. And very importantly, he provided health care for all of his workers, which grew into Kaiser. After the war, he tried to produce automobiles. Well, not so good. I don't know, maybe some of you have heard of the Kaiser, a car that kind of competed with Studebaker for being the worst car made. And of course, that did not last long. During the war, Richmond, California became very important. Ford had a huge assembly plant. I don't know if you can see it with the cursor, but this was pointing out into the bay, okay, into the San Francisco Bay. Richmond is a city on the western side of the bay, and the Ford plant was actually not as big as the shipyards that Kaiser built. 4 shipyards, they're labeled here, 1, 2, 3. This is where they built those 1,500 ships. Now, these weren't the battleships. They were being built in Brooklyn and down around the Norfolk area. These were freighters. Maybe heard of them, the Liberty ships. He started building before the war, about 1939, to build ships for England, to be given to England under Lend-Lease. During the war, it expanded enormously, to the extent where in the Richmond yards, they could literally build a ship in 6 days using prefabricated parts that they would weld together in these shipyards. Many of the workers in these yards were women. The famous Rosie the Riveter came out of these shipyards, and another one less famous, Wendy the Welder. The population of Richmond went from 20,000 to 100,000 in 3 years. Well, what these 100,000 people are going to get sick from time to time. And the federal government wasn't going to do anything, and there was no local government worthy of its name. So Kaiser took it under himself to build a whole new health system. This was the first part of it, the hospital for shipyard workers in Richmond, and it was the forerunner of Kaiser Permanente Health Management Organization. The Kaiser Permanente is a strange name. Kaiser Permanente was his cement company, and the first health facilities were built for them. But the name kind of stuck, and he managed to build an entire health system for his workers. Of course, it was all paid for by federal money, but the fact that he could do all this is quite remarkable. Well, not all was good. There was panic about the Japanese on the West Coast. The panic was that they would form a fifth column for an invasion. Just within a few days of Pearl Harbor, FBI agents rounded up around 1,000 first-generation Japanese in Hawaii and on the mainland. Within a month, these restrictions on Japanese were progressively increased, and by January 1942, okay, think of the date, January 1942, it's only a month after Pearl Harbor, there was agitation to remove the Japanese from the West Coast. It was an idea of John DeWitt, a commanding officer of the Western Defense Command, and the Chief of Staff, George Marshall, agreed. It went to the president, and on February 19th, 1942, FDR signed the infamous Executive Order 9066, authorized the mass incarceration of over 100,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, and over half were children. The intent was clearly racist because no such restrictions were made for German Americans or Italian Americans. Now, some historians have called these American concentration camps. My own view is that that is grotesque. These are nothing like the German concentration camps. There was no idea of genocide. And indeed, it only lasted about a year and a half. 1943, they were disbanded and the Japanese Americans allowed to go home. Not that there was much home for them to go to. There were Japanese regiments that fought in World War II in Europe and fought very successfully. What else was happening in the West in the war? In the Los Angeles area, there were Hispanic groups forming. There were actually several Hispanic groups, one of which were the people who had lived there for centuries, the old Californios from the gold rush. And then there was the new Hispanic groups that came to work in the war industries. They adopted what's called a zoot suit. A zoot suit. This was actually from Harlem, from the Black culture and the Harlem Renaissance. And they were They were adopted by the Hispanic gangs, but it wasn't all peaceful. Zoot war called near anarchy. What actually happened was that a group of sailors, white sailors, stationed in Long Beach, beat up a group of Hispanics who they thought had previously beat up some white sailors. A kind of war developed between the sailors and the Hispanic Latino gangs. The Los Angeles police could do nothing, and it raged for about 3 days. A lot of people were hurt, but nobody was killed. And finally, the MPs came in, the military police. They barricaded off the area and declared it off limits to military personnel. Well, war, I don't think so. That's a bit of an exaggeration. But it fomented the Hispanic gangs. The gangs existed before, but this really caused them to consolidate. And some of these gangs are the gangs that still exist today in southern Los Angeles, in the southern part of Los Angeles, and boiled over in Watts, along with the Black population. That was 27 years later. And it was still going. Well, we started out in the rural areas. Let's take a look at some of what happened to the cities, these little towns that were developed mainly to service the colonial economy. Looks like people in Denver are doing a lot more than that now. How about Albuquerque or Phoenix or Salt Lake, Dallas, Seattle? Guess what I left for last is California. Los Angeles. There is a there, except in San Fernando Valley. No, there's no there. And most important of all, San Francisco. My favorite, that's where I grew up, not in the city, but in the suburbs. And I think it's the most beautiful city in the world. That's all, folks. So, Meg, our time is up.
Your time is up. You have many, many questions.
I'm perfectly willing to stay here, but I don't know if that's allowed.
I don't have a problem with it. There's two ways I can handle it. I can allow you to go ahead and answer your questions, or I can email you the questions and you can typewrite them, keyboard them and send them out afterwards. But as long as people are willing to stay, I'm willing to let you answer questions. And I can also do both, which would be send the questions to you afterwards as well.
Let's do both.
Let's do both. Why not both?
How many people are still?
We have 145 right now.
Still with us. Wow. Okay. Yes. Shoot.
Okay. The first one, can you recommend a readable, accurate biography of William Wesley Powell? If I'm correct, he explored Colorado with a missing arm lost in the Civil War.
Yes. And I can, not off the top of my head, but put that in the written.
Yes, sir.
And I will recommend.
You will get them all so you can go through them again.
Right.
While all businesses and government departments were occurring, oil, water, what was happening in the West with population growth, or was it over by then?
The population growth in the total West did not go up enormously until World War II. And that's when it spiked. I gave a few of the numbers. And after the war, of course, a lot of those people stayed and attracted more people. So the Western population, and particularly the population in California and in Texas and in the state of Washington, continued to grow. I can remember reading in the 1950s or 60s when I was in high school that California population was about 15 million, and the what I read was that was as much as it could possibly hold in terms of production and food and water. Guess what the population is today? 40 million, just California. And that may be too much. Actually, in the last few years, more people left California than arrived. Okay, the population was still stable because of immigration, but actually more people left than arrived. But still, the population continued to grow after the war and has reached the heights of the heights that it is now.
Okay, we can't forget the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which caused several economic problems in the West and affected the whole country in agriculture. It also caused many to move to California and other places, which I think you kind of discussed in your program.
Yeah, I did. I tried to emphasize that.
Yes. Is the 20-year drought the longest in U.S. history?
I have read just a few days ago about that, and the answer is yes.
Okay. Has the drop in Lake Mead been solely the result of the drought, or has an increase in irrigation for agriculture and other reasons to draw more water from Lake Mead also contributed to the radical decline in Lake Mead?
No, the radical decline is almost entirely due to the drought. The Bureau of Reclamation that administers the water flow through Lake Mead has actually increased the amount that was sent to the Phoenix area to augment the Salt River there, but decreased the amount that was going to Los Angeles. And there was a lawsuit about that. And so Los Angeles is getting much less of the water from Lake Mead than it used to.
Okay, in the 1970s in Arizona, building was controlled to restrict the population growth proportional to the availability of water. Water rationing was a regular part of life. Agriculture was priority to recreation and self-indulgence. Then restrictions were lifted for development. Greed. Sad.
Yeah, although restrictions have come back. It seems a bit strange to people in the East, but it's actually against the law to hoard water. So if you have water running off your roof, you cannot say keep it in big water containers as we do in our house, because then we can use that water for watering the lawns and the like. And in many places, watering the lawns is illegal. And it was actually in California for a while, but I think that's been lifted. The water restrictions are coming back, and that stops or slows down a lot the development and new population coming into, say, the Phoenix area or the Tucson area.
Okay. Concerning the mega drought in the western states, how much of it can be attributed to periodic, repetitive events every 25 to 50 years, that's in parentheses, versus the major long-term global warming we are now beginning to experience?
Well, that's a major question that many scientists are working on, climate scientists. The latest that I've read is that the overall climate change is absolutely one of the contributors to the drought, but not necessarily the largest. And that these climate cycles that I mentioned and the person mentioned was probably the most important. But this has gone on too long. The climate cycles that I've read about are 15 to 20 years, but this drought has already been 20 years. Hopefully, with the big storms in California, which cause a lot of flooding and the like, that this drought is ending. But even with all the water coming out from the storms this winter, what I've read is that it's a drop in the bucket to fill all of the water needs that the drought has caused. And particularly, it is not going to fill up Lake Mead, for instance, but it'll certainly help.
Current U.S. population growth is very high in the West, parentheses, Texas, Arizona, Utah, etc., also Silicon Valley. Can the professor comment on reasons for this as opposed to Northeast and Midwest?
Well, the West was the big growth area after World War II, and that draws the population. The population that came during World War II, the growth was so enormous that after the war, the people who stayed and the people who stayed attracted other people to come to the magic land of the West. I can remember vaguely my own family. Now I was small, so I don't actually remember it very well. But after the war, my father was a scientist in Los Alamos and took a job actually in Indiana after he got his PhD at University of New Mexico. There was talk of the Golden West. It was the Golden State. And mostly people were talking about California. And that's when we moved to California. I was about 6 or 7, and that's where I grew up. But I think that there was a almost kind of a fad in the 50s and the 60s about moving to California. Movies had something to do with it, and the weather had a lot to do with it. Now, the growth of Seattle, I think, is later. That was a growth of technology industries. And of course, then the technology industries of Silicon Valley increased the growth. Those are the main things I can think of at the moment.
Okay, what would be the possibility of desalination industry to use some of the ocean water in the West? Don't some Middle East nations do this?
Well, the answer is yes, they do, and particularly Israel. And it has been thoroughly investigated in California, but it's just too darn expensive. It takes an enormous amount of power. Now, the idea, I think, was that they would use the power of nuclear power plants, particularly in California, but nuclear has gone out of
Favor.
And they just can't, it just doesn't make sense to use so much power to produce the amount of fresh water that would produce.
And a recommendation for a book, Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan for the dust storms.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
What is your prediction based on past droughts? How and when will the current 20-year drought in California and Colorado end?
Well, I wish I knew. I am not a climate scientist. And so my opinion about that is probably not as good as what you could read in the newspapers. But there is a cycle. The drought is likely to end. California has gone through long droughts before, and I can remember some, but nothing like the current drought. But hopefully it will be ending soon, and maybe with these storms, that'll be the beginning of the end.
Okay. The next two questions are about the Tennessee Valley Authority. It says, what about the TVA, and was the TVA a spinoff of the REA?
Well, the TVA was one of the New Deal projects and agencies, basically to make one large power company for most of the middle southeast. And whether that was originally an REA project, I don't know. I somehow kind of doubt it. But anyway, I don't know that much about the TVA.
Okay. Comment, I lived in Los Angeles from 1989 to 2000, lived in Westchester neighborhood built by Kaiser. Home was called a Kaiser home. They were all identical.
Yes. Well, there they were. Kaiser built whole towns. Now, I don't know Westchester, but it's kind of like the Levittown, is it Levittown in the east, where whole towns were built with identical, inexpensive houses. And as I remember reading, that was very, very important in the flight to the suburbs after the war. Probably the same in California, but with Kaiser towns.
You do have a comment here. There were, in fact, camps to intern Italians during the war, and later on there's a similar one about Germans.
I haven't read about those. I know there were restrictions of German and Italian Americans, but they were really very mild restrictions compared to the Japanese, who were, literally taken from their homes and put out in these camps all around the country. But I don't think there was anything like that for German Americans and Italian Americans.
Okay. One more question about your own subjective experiences of growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area. Considering your grasp of history of California, how would you characterize the social and economic development of California?
Oh my goodness. That's a pretty big one. I don't know, when I was growing up in California, it was mostly in the 50s and 60s. Went to Stanford at the end of the 60s, and then I moved away in kind of the mid 70s. And although I've been back many, many times, I've never lived in California. I thought California was great. But that was my experience as a white male. The experience of others are probably not so good. But the politics of California totally changed from when I lived there. I probably wouldn't recognize it anymore because it's become very, very liberal, the famous left coast. And the technology industry, even though it started around Stanford, when I left Stanford in 1972, it had really not taken off at all. So I think the technology industry, the famous Silicon Valley, really changed things substantially.
Okay. Can the person who mentioned Italian camps during World War II provide a source of information?
Okay.
And
if that person would send in the email either
I think this may be the response, Google and geological records. So, and were property owners in Texas who had oil on them first to have wells built anywhere on their land, on their property, even close to their residence?
Yeah, Until the TRC started regulating things pretty severely by roughly the late 20s, it was a free-for-all. You could build it anywhere. And in California, they built an oil well on the school, Beverly Hills High School. No, there was no restrictions. It was the Wild West.